little bit about me, again. I spent the past 6 years working for Chinatown Community Development Center, which is a community-based organization in San Francisco. We do affordable housing and community empowerment work. I ran the Youth Leadership Empowerment and Organizing Program, working with young people in high schools throughout San Francisco. And currently I'm serving on the Board of Education here in San Francisco. I had never really thought about running for office. Like many of the folks in this room, I had started out as a student activist, I had majored in Asian American Studies, had fought for ethnic studies while I was in college, and had decided to go into the nonprofit community organizing world because I really wanted to serve my community. When you do community work, you end up doing a lot of advocacy work. And you learn about the connections between doing good community work and networking, working in City Hall, working on citywide initiative campaigns for reforms. And I ended up inadvertently getting involved in a lot of local politics. To give a little perspective, though, I had never really believed that much in electoral politics. I had worked on a lot of initiative campaigns, and for those of you that remember, I had worked on No Against Prop 209 when I was a college student. And a lot of other initiatives that had happened throughout the state, whether it was No on 54, and a lot of local initiatives in San Francisco. And it was always easy working for initiative campaigns because it's an issue. There was a good side and a bad side. And an issue never changes. Like, you always believed in what you were working for. But I never believed in candidates, and I always avoided working on candidates who were running for office, because I never was sure if I trusted them. And there are just a lot of things about politics that you don't trust. And when I voted, it was always like I was choosing between the lesser of two evils, who was a little bit better than the next person. During a lot of the campaign work that I did while I was in San Francisco, I did end up meeting a few electeds that I did believe in. And they were often electeds that had started out as community organizers and advocates, and through their work ended up representing their community. And in doing that work, I was really amazed by some of the changes that they were actually able to make on a local political level. Electeds such as Jeff Adachi, Chris Daly, Matt Gonzalez, Mark Sanchez. And those folks really inspired me to think a little bit differently about what local politics meant for a community. And I learned a really important lesson. Often when you think about activism, you think about civil rights issues, but you don't often think about the budget and the money and how money is being spent and how that's serving our community. And in that process, I learned that it was really important for us as activists to think about those terms and to have control and say about how we spend our money. In fact, when you look at a city budget or you look at the national budget, that budget says who the priorities are, who the people that are privileged are, who the government cares about, and who is going to get served. After I worked on a mayoral campaign in 2003, a couple of folks had approached me and asked me to consider to run for the local Board of Education. And of course, when they first approached me, I said, no way. It's not something that I want to do. I want to stay in the community organizing world. That's not the route I want to take. But a couple of things ended up changing my mind. One, I looked at the Board of Education at that time, and this was about 2 years ago. And I didn't feel like the Board of Ed really reflected the community that it was serving. To give a little perspective, San Francisco is, the district at least, is 90% students of color. It's over 50% Asian American, over 70% immigrant, and overwhelmingly low income. And I looked at the board and I didn't see that kind of diversity on the board. I also looked at a lot of the candidates that were running that year, and none of the candidates had worked directly with students, and I had spent the past 5 years working directly with high school students in our public schools. And I also didn't see any candidates that were making young people a priority in their platform. Another thing that actually pushed me was that I had worked on a lot of local campaigns in San Francisco, and as diverse as San Francisco is, and as progressive as it is, when you look at the people that are working on campaigns, very few of them are people of color, very few of them are women. And in the campaign meetings, you actually hear things that reflect the reality of how people perceive our community. And one thing that I often heard over and over again in campaigns is you have limited amount of time. You have a limited amount of time to outreach to voters and to develop a platform. And over I heard, we're not going to go to the Asian American community because they don't vote. So there's no reason to do precinct walks in those neighborhoods, and there's no reason to have a platform that reflects things that that community wants. And it's not just the Asian American community. They said the same thing about the African American community and the Latino community. And this is something that was very frustrating for me. And in the end, I decided that I did want to run because I wanted to be a part of that change. I wanted to be a part of the change, to change who runs for office and why they run for office. So I ran 2 years ago, and I lost. And then last year, I decided to run again. And I miraculously came in first place, running a grassroots campaign with very little money. And I had one of the largest volunteer base of any campaign, and also the youngest campaign. So that's a little bit about my story, and I want to share 3 lessons that I have learned in my experience. And the first is the importance of building community. The second is coalition building. And the third is knowing your history and where you're headed. When I was in college, and this is the first lesson, the importance of building community, I was on staff at the Asian American Theme House. It was called Okada. At the time, my resident dean was an amazing Asian American woman who is still my mentor and role model, Nadine Cruz. And I was one of those activist students. I wanted to come out the first day and, start talking about Vincent Chin, the LA riots, start talking about race and class and all of those issues. And Nadine actually kind of pulled me back and said, we're not ready to do that yet. We're gonna wait. And I was just like, wait, I don't wanna wait. I wanna start doing this now. We gotta change everybody. Change is urgent. And she said, no, we need to build community first. So we actually spent the first quarter doing nothing but social community building. Water fights, field trips, all of those things. We didn't do anything that was political that first quarter. And I was getting really antsy. But then the second quarter, she said, we're ready now. Let's start doing the documentaries. Let's start having the discussions. Let's start bringing the panels and start talking about race. And I saw something that was really amazing. And that was that everybody came to our programs. And at Stanford, where I went to college, sorry, I'm here for grad school at Berkeley, but the theme dorms could only be 50% of the ethnicity that it was representing. So it was only 50% Asian American. So it was 50% other, and a lot of people were very unhappy about being placed in an ethnic theme house. But when we had these events in our second and third quarter, everybody came. The sorority sisters came, the athletes came, the Asian American students came, and the diversity of the Asian American students came, those that were activists and those that didn't care about issues relating about race or at the time. And it was really amazing, and people came because they cared about each other. And they came because they wanted to listen to one another, and they listened to each other's stories, and they really had thoughtful discussions around race and class. It was one of the most amazing communities I'd ever been a part of. And it was through that I learned the importance of community building and social change, and how it's important to make and do that work. The second lesson that I learned is the importance of coalition building, which I'm sure many of the students in this room have engaged in. I'm also sure that you've seen in many of our struggles that activists and different communities fight over the crumbs, instead of fighting for a larger piece of the pie or expanding the pie. And I'll give an example. When we were fighting for ethnic studies at Stanford, African American studies had already been established, and we were fighting for Asian American studies, Chicano studies, and Native American studies. And at the time, the faculty and the administration would set up things like, okay, well, we'll do that, but then we have to start taking away funding from the African American studies program. And then the students and the communities would end up fighting over money and faculty positions. And that happens all the time. And coalition building is difficult, but it has to be intentional, thoughtful, and built over time. I've been part of successful coalitions, and I've been a part of unsuccessful coalitions, even still to this day. But it must happen. There's no other way. And often, it happens through social building, and friendships. And the best coalitions that I've often seen between different communities were often through friends, whether they were roommates of different ethnic groups or friendships that were engaged. And those were often the strongest coalitions that happened. The most recent example that I have is that when I ran for school board the second time, I ran with an African-American single mother. She was also a women's activist. People told us that we shouldn't run together as a coalition. They told us that we would be fighting for the same endorsements, the same funders, the same volunteers, that people would only support one progressive candidate, not two. And in the beginning, it was very hard. There were times that we didn't work together. But in the end, we realized that it was so important for both of us to win, because if only one of us won, we wouldn't make a difference on the board. So in the end, we did work together, and we defied expectations, and amazingly, we both won. And everybody had told us that there was no way that both of us were going to win, and we did. And that was the importance of persistence in coalition building. And now we have a progressive majority on the Board of Education, and a board that has 6 out of 7 people of color and 4 out of 7 women. And it's the first time the Board of Education has ever looked like this in San Francisco, and it is finally reflecting the diversity of our student body. The third lesson, of course, is to know your history and to think deeply about your principles. I can't emphasize how important it is to know your history, and I'm sure many of the folks in this room, because you are active in the community, have taken the time to learn your history, to know where you're going. It's also important to think deeply about your principles. They are your guide, they will be your guide. Another Asian American woman who is a judge, Lillian Singh, I once heard her say in a speech that it's really important to know your true north. But I also want to add to that, it's also important to surround yourself with people who share your true north. You'll often be challenged in life, and it's so important to surround yourself with people that you believe in and that you trust. And I'll give an example of this through my campaign. The first time I ran, near the end of the campaign, someone asked me what surprised me the most about running. And I had to think really hard about it, because there were a lot of things that didn't surprise me. I knew that politics was going to be dirty. I knew it was going to be tough. There were a lot of things, and I knew that there was corruption and that there was money involved. So none of that really surprised me. It was very different to experience it than to know it, but it didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me was that I thought about it, and I realized that I had become a better person. And this is why. Before I decided to run, one of my little worries was that I would somehow magically start becoming corrupt or selling out. And I didn't know how it was going to happen, but I kind of thought it would start happening in the campaign process. I was really lucky in the fact that because of who I was and my beliefs, not a lot of people with money wanted to support me. The folks that worked on my campaign were students. They were high school students. They were alumni of our youth program, and they were community organizers. So I didn't have a lot of money. I actually didn't have a lot of major endorsements. And I watched folks that I respected and loved climbing ladders, put my signs up, working until 1 in the morning, precinct walking. I'm doing all this stuff for free. And watching that, I started speaking even stronger on the things that I believed in. When I first started running, people told me to hold back a little bit on my beliefs and kind of be a little bit more centered in what I said. And they said, when you're in office, you can do whatever you want. And so in the beginning, I did kind of take that approach. But when I was watching my students and I was watching my friends and people that I respect in the community spending all these hours for free working on the campaign, I knew that I couldn't do that anymore. I knew that I had to speak up for what was right and what they believed in. And in the end, it made me a better person. And I learned something really important, which was that it's not just important to have your own principles and belief, but to have people that surround you that share those principles and belief, and they will hold you strong. And I know still to this day that if I ever did anything that disappointed them, that they would tell me that I was selling out. And that's really important, because it is hard to know when and what challenges you'll be faced and how you'll respond to it. Someone said something really interesting to me yesterday, and they said, we are either divided by default or unified by design. Change doesn't just happen. It must be thoughtful, intentional. It has to be hard work, and it will always take time. I wanted to thank you all for inviting me to this event and to thank the student organizers that put this on. I also organized a women's event when I was in college. It was not this big, and I really like the idea of the men serving the women and all the food. So I do want to thank all the organizers. Kevin mentioned this earlier. It is so important to get to know the people at your table and to do the networking. These are the people that you'll be working with for life. And in the community building, the coalition building, and remembering your principles and surrounding people who share those principles with you. Thank you very much.